Iraq orders international airlines to stop flying into its Kurdish region. It follows Monday's vote on secession, which passed with overwhelming support. But will Baghdad's pressure force the regional government to cancel the result, or will it backfire? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme today with me, Peter Dobbie. Now, the government of Iraq is suspending all international flights to and from Erbil in its northern, autonomous Kurdish region. People in the area took part in a secession vote on Monday that Baghdad and other governments, including crucially Turkey, have strongly opposed. Almost 93% voted for the referendum, but the Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi's administration calls it unconstitutional. It's also demanding full control of the region's oil revenue and border crossings. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Hoda Abdelhamid sets up our discussion from Erbil.
There are no more international flights to and from the airports of Erbil and Sulaymaniyah, and that should last until the end of the year. From now on, only humanitarian, emergency and military flights will be allowed to land or take off, but with prior coordination with the authorities in Baghdad. Domestic flights continue as scheduled, but many of the people who are leaving today, especially the Kurds of the diaspora who had come here to be part of referendum day, said that they had cut short their holiday here simply because they did not feel safe to transit through the airport in Baghdad. Now, the Kurdistan regional government is also refuting to adapt any of the measures demanded by the Iraqi parliament. There's 12 steps that have been issued on Wednesday. The government here saying that those are unconstitutional. You hear the same word unconstitutional coming out from Prime Minister Abadi. He calls unconstitutional the referendum that took place earlier in the week. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any meeting point between the two sides. The KRG also refuting to hand over the border crossings with Iran or Turkey, also calling that step illegitimate, saying that they have the right to keep that. So certainly a lot of worry for the people here. Many said that they had enjoyed voting in that referendum, but now it's bittersweet. This is Hoda Abdelhamid for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our panel in Stockholm. Kamran Matin, senior lecturer specialising in Kurdish studies at the University of Sussex in Baghdad. Ahmed Rushdi, director at the House of Iraqi Expertise Foundation, and in Erbil, Dlawer, Ala-aldeen, president of the Middle East Research Institute. Welcome to you all. The lawyer Ala-aldeen, this deadline, what does it actually mean?
Well, this has been anticipated. It will mean a lot of inconveniences for both the Kurds and the international network of business, friends, diplomats, tourists, and you name it. People see it as a very nonsensical, punitive measure taken, which is really also seen as pointless because it will not serve any purpose. People will not, or resolve of the Kurdish leaders will not be in any way moved by this. And many people expect it to be temporary because if the Kurds could not convince Baghdad to restart it, the international community will and the airlines will. And certainly people, the authorities here have opened doors to Baghdad saying, come and run it yourself, we will do what it takes. But Baghdad is not offering any alternative. So while this is just causing problems and inconveniences, it may seem as though they are isolating Kurdistan, but in reality, the Kurds are not very worried about this, because if that's the kind of measure coming, then that's not the end of the world. This will be a transient thing, and then they can overcome that. There are many alternative ways. So this, people are watching whether to see this will be followed by other measures or not. But you can see from the airports that how people are desperately panicking to go home, but the day-to-day ordinary people here are not moved by it.
Kamran Matin in Baghdad, will they, do you think, actually seal the borders?
Well, I think with respect to the air traffic, there is certain authority on the Iraqi side to do so by asking international airlines not to fly to Iraq, using its prerogative as a state. But I think, as your previous guest said, Iraqi Kurdistan's connection with outside world can continue via land. And there is a more general point regarding basically sanctions, whether diplomatic or economic. And I think Iraq's own experience during the 90s, when it experienced some of the most comprehensive sanctions in modern history against the Ba'ath regime of Saddam Hussein, demonstrated that actually sanctions in and of themselves are unlikely to kind of bend the will of a determined actor in international politics. So I'm not sure that sanctions actually would serve the purpose, especially given that the Kurdish side has clearly stated that this referendum is non-binding, and they are actually happy to negotiate from this point on with the central state in Baghdad. So I think the apparently quite harsh stance which Baghdad is taking has to do more with the domestic politics in Iraq, i.e. the parts of Iraq outside Kurdistan of Iraq. Even the 2018 elections which coming up, and Prime Minister Abadi seems to be trying to appease the more hardliners around Mr. Maliki, who want to take a stronger position against the Kurdistan regional government because of the referendum.
Mr. Maliki, of course, being the former Iraqi Prime Minister, Ahmed Rushdi in Baghdad. Is that a fair consideration in your mind? Because the Iraqi Prime Minister has to go to the polls next year. Mr. Barzani, the leader in the Kurdish region, he's due to step down next month.
Well, still, Mr. Abadi is the Prime Minister of all of Iraq. So he actually must do what he can do. He's the higher commander of the Iraqi army. He has so many authorities that it's supposed to be for the unity of Iraq, that's supposed to be used for the unity of Iraq. But the most important thing is that, politically speaking, he has so many pressures. He has from the Shiite parties. There are so many pressure from the Shiite parties, from Iran, from Turkey, and also, of course, from the Hashid, from the PM forces also, which means that he's looking for the 2018 elections in a way that all these procedures that he mentioned, he became in the Shiite community, it's supposed to be the most important men. That means he's raising up his name in front of his society. But on the other hand, we all know that it's supposed to be there was negotiations before the referendum, and he asked for the negotiations before the referendum that happened this week. That now what's happening now is that now the Kurds and Mr. Barzani, President Barzani, is actually asking for the negotiations. My feeling is that all these harsh procedures, maybe it will be appeared now, but it will be in a way or another a way for negotiations between Baghdad and Erbil. Now, step down from the referendum is the Iraqi government asking for step down from the referendum, refuse the results. Maybe Kurdistan, or let's say Erbil, may frozen the results rather than reject the results. It's a way of negotiations that at the end, it will end to the, on the table. Iraq does not need another crisis. We have so many things to deal with. We have Daesh, we have the financial crisis, and so on. And at the end, the Kurds are Iraqis. It's supposed to be that we all learn the lessons from previous history. Well, we have 8 years war with Iran. We have sanctions for about 13 years. So it's supposed to be all those lessons that learned by the Iraqi leaders.
Okay, we could have a separate program. Just to interrupt you for a second, we could have another discussion about how the Kurds see themselves, and then we'd have to talk to the Kurds in Iran and the diaspora worldwide. That's not specifically what we're talking about. Dlawer, Ala-aldeen, how can they unpick this, as our contributor from Baghdad is suggesting they will inevitably have to, when, for example, there was a trilateral agreement put in place very securely last Friday, and in that sense, the players who have a vested interest in the Kurdish region not getting more autonomy than it has already got, they want to keep the status quo.
The neighbouring countries are trying to get the Kurds in Iraq to solve their problems. In other words, they think that by keeping the Iraqi Kurds either prevented from independence or even suppressed, that is one way of solving the problems across the border, where they really should be adopting more overarching policies towards the Kurdish question and more democratization and more civil rights, and they should deal with their issues internally. And the history has shown over the last 25 years that Iraqi Kurds incrementally had acquired greater sovereignty over their decisions, yet this did not affect the neighbors across the border. And of course, the Kurds in Turkey and in Iran, they have their grievances, and it's unrelated to what happens in Kurdistan. Of course, emotionally, culturally, in many other ways, what happens in Iraq affects them, but it's a wrong way around to expect the Iraqi Kurds to solve these problems by them not asking for what they deserve. The Iraqis as well, they need to see that this cornering, this pressurization, this agreement with Iran and Turkey against the Kurds can only make matters worse, can only increase the gap between the Kurds and the neighbors, or at least the Iraqi government. The previous speaker quite rightly said that the Iraqi government, maybe like the Iranian and Turkish governments, everybody's electioneering, everybody's under pressure, and everybody wants to calm things down. So Mr. Abadi is actually among the Shias. He's now the only man in a position of power who can make decisions. But the House of Shia, where the decisions used to be made, is now very divided, very fragmented, and they are between themselves, they are electioneering, so trying to appear tough for their own voters' appeal, so that's populism. But internally, behind the scene, they think this is very damaging, very bad. So the best way forward is what the Kurds are emphasizing, is that the time for negotiation is never over. This referendum was just an opinion poll. Let's talk about how we can design the future. So the Turks have realized that. They were tough, they spoke tough, but actually they did not take any serious measures to make life more difficult for themselves or the Kurds. The Iranians are exactly the same. They're speaking tough. They think this was a mistake made by the Kurds, but they are not closing the border. They are not doing anything, any harsh measure that would make it difficult for them to mend fences in the future. Iraq needs to do the same. I can also predict that now we are into Ashura. Ashura is not one day. It will take a whole week, and politics will actually take a week break. And after that, people will have to then see what can be done and use the language of debate, of dialogue. And it's only then, when they think properly, adopting new vision and strategies, they can exchange projects, exchange ideas, come up with a way forward. So that's really the healthiest way of managing this crisis.
Well, many Kurds in Iraq and elsewhere have welcomed the referendum, but others, including the US, are worried it could lead to violence in an already sensitive region. Donald Trump's administration signalled its frustration and said the US was, quote, deeply disappointed with the referendum, but it would not affect US-Kurdish relations. France has warned of the destabilising effects of the vote and says it could provoke new major crises across the Middle East. Iran has closed its border and halted all flights to the Kurdish region. Turkey is threatening military intervention and, as we mentioned earlier, it'll now only negotiate with Baghdad for oil exports. Let's talk to Ahmed Rushdi in Baghdad. What are the chances, as a reaction to this, what looks like a stranglehold on the airport, Barzani, say over the next 24 hours or the next week, after Ashura, give him 10 days, he declares full independence. Is that likely?
I don't think it will make the Kurds more go to the extreme. In a way or another, they are asking for negotiations and waiting for a positive response happen by the Iraqi government, maybe because of international community pressure will happen to open wide the negotiations between Baghdad and Erbil. But let us say something which is very important. The problem is that in 2003, actually there is a deal happened between the Iraqi government and the KRG, is that Iraqi government will give 17% from the annual budget from the Iraqi government to Erbil, and it started from 2003 until 2015 or 2014. So there's a problem now, some sort of problems that we gave you the money to stay in Iraq. Now you want to be outside Iraq, so give us back our money. So it's some sort of levels of sanctions, airports, land, borders, and now we are maybe there are talk about financial crisis. It will be happen between Baghdad and Erbil about the 17%. Maybe it will escalating for more. But I think with the presence of the UN, with the presence of the international community in Baghdad, I think there will be some sort of movement against any harsh measurements for the Kurdish people, especially the Kurdish people already, hospitalized about 3 million refugees. Most of them are Iraqi. So it's supposed to be one of the important events that happened to the Iraqis, that they went to Kurdistan, they've been welcomed in Kurdistan. So even on the social level, now the people in Baghdad looking for Kurdistan as a safe zone for them. So it's some sort of contradictory for what's happening between the political level and the social level. But at the end, I hope, and maybe it will take time, at the end there will be a negotiating table, and at the end maybe the referendum itself, it will be negotiated for its results and maybe for its fate. So at the end, well, what's going to happen? What is the kind of relations between Baghdad and Erbil?
Let's talk about that idea about a relationship between Baghdad and Erbil. Kamran, Matin in Stockholm. Is an independent Kurdish state, let's call it Kurdistan, is an independent Kurdistan better or worse than a dependent Kurdish region when it comes to the fight against ISIL, and also the way that refugees are spread out around northern Iraq, partly because of what's going on in that fight against ISIL in Iraq and in Syria?
Well, really, the question of independence is always depends on specific circumstances of a particular people and a particular country within which they live. I mean, what you hear from the Iraqi Kurds is that their experience with Iraqi state since its inception about 100 years ago has been simply systematic violence, suppression, negligence, and various forms of sanctions and so on. So they entered into the new relation with Iraqi state after 2003 war, after the overthrow of the Saddam regime, hoping that they would be part of an inclusive, broadly secular state, and that was the basis on which they claimed they actually accepted the United States in kind of invitation that they would remain within the Iraqi state. Since then, things have not really evolved the way they envisaged at the time. For example, this question of disputed territories, which is at the heart of this problem of especially oil-rich Kirkuk region. The Constitution of Iraq of 2005 specifically states in its Article 140 that by 2007, i.e. 10 years ago, there should have been referendum in these territories so that they could decide their formal affiliation, whether to the KRG or to the central state. This never took place. The distribution of the federal budget has been also contested. As your previous guest said, this was suspended by the central state, all the while that central government, in fact, kept paying government employees in the regions taken over by the ISIS, which is quite a contradictory approach to take. Now, the oil issue seems to be the central government's kind of opposition point, i.e. they say the Kurds have marketed their oil bypassing Baghdad. Now, one could say that, well, Iraqi Kurds did so only because the budget from the center was suspended, but also because, again, Iraqi constitution states that parts of Iraq which experienced disproportionate deprivation under the previous regime could, for a specific period of time, receive an extra share from the overall budget. And the Kurds might argue that their sale of the oil is actually consistent with the spirit of this particular article in the Constitution.
OK, we'll come on to that point of the economy in just a second, but I just want to get to another couple of key points, because Monday's vote increased oil prices to more than a 2-year high this week, and there are concerns it could unsettle the markets for weeks to come. The Kurdish regional government generates 80% of its revenue by selling oil overseas using pipelines that go through Turkey. But after the vote, Turkey threatened to shut down those pipelines that transport about 500,000 barrels of oil a day. The government in Baghdad has asked oil traders to stop dealing with the Kurds directly and has ruled out any talks with the Kurds on the referendum result. Well, on the other side of Iraq, of course, we're talking about Iran. Let's put one of those key points to Dlawer Ala-aldeen. Is the idea of an independent Kurdish region anathema to Tehran? Because that would surely scupper Iran's idea, its desire for a Shia crescent through the Middle East.
The Iranian point of view, their major concern is not really so much independence of Kurdistan. There are two issues there. They want a good neighbor. They want Kurdistan to be a reliable, stabilizing partner in Iraq, in the vicinity, in the neighborhood, but also should not affect the Kurds in Iran. Now, the Iranians are looking at the bigger picture. The Shia crescent you mentioned may be one. Their bigger agenda is spreading their influence and across the Middle East, is to really their eyes on America, Israel, Turkish rivalry, Saudi Arabia. So they do not really see the Kurds as being the primary target of their concern, but they want the Kurds to, if anything they gain, any level of sovereignty, should not be a threat to their national security, and this entity should be a friend. The Iranians, when it comes to the Kurds, they think it's a very important strategic issue to have the Shias of Iraq and the Kurds being still allies and having good relation. They're always emphasizing that this strategic relation should remain intact, and they also want stability inside Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, when there is this kind of moves or referendum or moves towards independence, when everybody's worried, the Iranians are actually more calm than everybody else. They are fairly confident about their ability to control events in Baghdad, and they are engaging the Kurds. They were a bit surprised by the Kurdish stubbornness, but I come back to this point about the international community's response when you mentioned oil. Only a few years ago,
Al-Abadi, I'm going to have to interrupt you, which I apologise, but we are very close to the end of the programme, and I do want to get to a couple of key points. Kamran, Matin in Stockholm, is there any way that the deadline we're talking about as of now to do with the airport and what that might evolve into, is there any way this deadline and the referendum can end well for everyone?
I think it can, because none of the apparently most enraged actors about this referendum are in a position to really intervene directly. Iraqi government cannot really resort to violence because its performance militarily against ISIS does not really inspire confidence. And in the absence of air support by the United States, which is obviously inconceivable, it's not clear how exactly they want to actually press their points upon the Kurdish side. Iran will not take the bait of intervening in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan, which would invite potentially retribution from the United States, which is quite aggressive these days against Iran. It wants to revise the nuclear deal. It wants to bring to the table the question of the ballistic missiles of Iran and all sorts of other issues they have with Iran. Turkey, on the other hand, has a multi-billion-dollar trade with KRG. It is depending on actually KRG to at least partly kind of contain the PKK against which it is at war, and is also increasingly hoping to rely on KRG to contain Syrian Kurds.
I'm going to interrupt you there because I want to give the last 30 seconds of the programme to Ahmed Rushdi in Baghdad. What are the chances here that Mr Barzani has used this vote as a marker from which he is prepared to come back to then start negotiations?
It also can be a point to restart his future plan for his political pathway. And at the end, Mr. Barzani is not legitimate. He's not the president of KRG legitimately. Now, maybe it will pave the way to a new round for his presidentship as a president for KRG, because there is a referendum, and there will be, as he promised, there will be elections in next November. So it's a way to know exactly it's a way to know exactly what's going to happen for his future in the, let's say, the next six, maybe 12 years or 10 years. At the other hand, I think Mr. Barzani launched an invitation for the negotiations, and he is accepting, or let's say he's expecting, the international community to support his idea about negotiating not the referendum, but negotiating the result of the referendum, which is two different things, which is, maybe it will end for something that Iran and Turkey will accept, and also maybe the Iraqi government, which is confederalism between Baghdad and Erbil, which has already happened even before the referendum. So eventually talks will begin, and just as I said, negotiating table is ready. Maybe it will not be in Iraq. Maybe it will be one of the countries of the international community, Paris, London, no one knows, maybe even Washington.
Okay.
But maybe the umbrella of the UN, it will be the best way to start with.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thanks to all our guests, Kamran, Matin, Ahmed, Rushdi and the lawyer Ala-aldeen. And thank you to you, too, for your time. You can see the programme again anytime via the website aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or tweet me. I'm @PeterDobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the entire team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye for now.